All right, so the challenge here is to make promises sound interesting in 5 minutes. So my background is Miguel Castillo is my name. I work at Symphono, great place to work at, they mentioned it. I love the open source community. I have my GitHub account, Twitter handle. Don't use it as much as I should, I guess, but today I'm going to be talking about a little crash course in promises. So, promises. Here is the prescribed definition. It's a construct that facilitates building workflows around synchronous operations and whatever. But I guess the part that you should take away from this whole thing is that promises is equivalent to something like I'll promise you a value type of thing, regardless of your execution path. You can have execution code that is throwing exceptions left and right. It doesn't matter. You're always going to get a value. You're going to be basically getting values out of an asynchronous operation, whether it's faulty or not. You're going to get something out of it. So with that, I mean, the problem primarily comes from the integration point between synchronous code and asynchronous code. This is a very complex problem that JavaScript suffers a lot from, because JavaScript is a very asynchronous natured language, right? You have AJAX calls going left and right to log in, to get information about whatever, and then you have to somehow update the DOM. And all of the stuff happens in no particular order, but you have to put some sort of a order to that. So return values from function calls is one of the biggest issues that promises are trying to resolve. When you go through code and you execute step A, you get a result out of it in your synchronous code. Exception handling is something that is a little more settled. It's much more settled because, generally speaking, when you try when you execute some code and you get you basically get an exception out of it in a regular synchronous paradigm, you basically end up with a catch getting that error. Now with asynchronous, it's a little more difficult because you don't know when you're going to get that value back. You don't know when if somebody throws an exception. Once the try goes through the code, you're basically out of the execution scope for the try catch. So when an exception is thrown, you lose that whole context. You have no way to catch it. So that is a very important aspect of promises, being able to get an exception out of some code that is executing somewhere else after you get some result and you process it. You want to be able to then report that back up the exception chain. So show me some code. This is not a very elaborate presentation because promises are not very exciting. But I put together something with synchronous. So here's the happy path, right? I'm going to hide this thing first. Here basically I have a... Oh, yes, sorry. How is that? I wish it was that simple in real life. But okay, so you have basically get data. You're trying to get some information out of some synchronous code, and whatever that comes back, you put it in the DOM, right? And in the same down here, you basically run through some code, you get an exception, whatever, and then you get the exception and you write it to the DOM. It's a very trivial piece of code, but it basically reflects a very overly simplified notion of what synchronous is. You basically get the data, you return some value, you get it there. With an exception, you basically, whatever piece of code throws an exception, you handle it very clearly here. You have your try, you get your exception, and it's not a very interesting piece of code. I mean, there's the happy path, that's it, it worked. You have your sync operation, and then you have someone throw an exception at me. Where it gets more interesting is that the space between. That's kind of what I call promises. The space between where you have an asynchronous operation and synchronous operations, right? That spot where if you're not careful, you're not going to get your results back. You're not going to be able to handle your exceptions. So in this case, it's a raw representation of what would happen. So in this case, I'm still calling get data. And because I don't know when that data is going to be available. It's going to be a set timeout in 3 seconds. I can't use that result value back into I can't introduce it into the DOM effectively because I don't know when it's going to be ready. I put 3 seconds to basically kind of illustrate the point that you don't have that value available readily. So you don't know, there is no easy way to basically get that data into the DOM. In this case, I'm also throwing an exception. This is actually the tricky part that is not very obvious. Throwing an exception within an asynchronous operation. And I'll show what that kind of looks like in the code. So when I run through this, so undefined, that got me the value because nothing was available at the time. Nothing came back, and you see the exception was not even properly handled. Somebody in some asynchronous piece of code threw an exception, and off you go. okay, I got to rush through this. I got to get to the good stuff. So I'm going to convert that basically and introduce you to callback hell. It sucks. Don't get there. That's why promises were introduced to a degree. So in this case, I'm basically passing in a callback into get data. And get data is then basically going to say, hey, whenever you're ready, get me that result. This works pretty well. It's very narrow in scope here because I'm not doing any sort of complex operations. But imagine if you're running some, you're trying to chain results. Going through chaining results in this particular paradigm, you end up in the callback hell. So if you're not too familiar with it, Google it up. You're going to find why this is so horrible. But I'm going to skip over this because I got to get through the good part. So this is basically the nasty aspect of it. You pass a function in there. You're going to get eventually an error or a positive result. It's very cumbersome because you have if statements sprinkled around your logic. Not very friendly. With promises, it's a little different because in a promise you say, hey, get me that piece of data, and whenever you're done, I want to actually put it into the actual DOM. I mean, this is the direct translation from the old synchronous code to a more modern approach where you have an actual callback saying, hey, I have some good data for you. Print it out. And in this case, you don't have an if statement. And the same for the exception handling. In the exception handling, this particular piece of code is throwing an exception, and I'm still able to get a hold of that exception by saying get exception. Whenever that piece of code is done executing, if there is a failure, let me know about it. So in this case, I'm just putting that. It cleans up the code a lot. So it's a beautiful thing when you talk about promises compared to the whole hell callback thing. So in this case, async operation, you clean that whole piece of code out, and you can get the actual proper results into the screen. Okay, rushing a little more. So some of the important features about promises is that the values are persisted in the promise itself. So once the promise is resolved, that's the value they always get. They're not, you can't change it, so they're immutable in that regard. So if it fails, you're always going to get a failure. That's really nice because you can pass that object around, and you're going to be able to basically always have that value cached, and you can propagate that through your entire application without having to reevaluate, for example, an AJAX call. More code. I'm going to skip that one. Actually, no, this is actually interesting. So, for example, for the DOM, in jQuery, you have the onReady. This is actually on the new onReady thing that you pass $, you pass a function, and you get a callback in it. The DOM, whenever it's ready, it's just ready. It doesn't matter when it happens. It could be now, it could be 30 minutes from now. You're always going to get a successful callback. That is a very important aspect of promises, where you are always going to get a good value out of your execution code. Workflows is the next aspect of this, where with workflows you can actually take AJAX calls or whatever types of asynchronous calls, and you can put workflow around it. This is a fantastic thing that, for building applications in more real-life stuff, so you can actually do a get login. And once the login is done, you can actually put in the login message into your DOM. And then once that login is done, you can then say, okay, get me some books. And then once that's done, you can write it into the actual books, into the actual DOM. And then once that's done, you can actually get artists. And that basically gives you a workflow around all of the asynchronous operations that you have in a real application. So the nice thing about it is you can actually do aggregation of promises. In this case, I'm just going to say, hey, login. And whenever I get that, I'm going to transform that result, and then I'm going to push it back into another promise. And then whenever these two promises are done, I'm actually going to be able to append all that data into the DOM. So it's actually a very nice way to basically aggregate data that might not even exist at the time that you actually are registering the events. Or you're basically running through a sequence of operations like login, and whenever that you're logged in, you get your artist and get your books. That's it. Did I go over the 10 minutes? Okay, no more code. Okay. That's it.
We're good.
Okay, good.